art of transcendent knowledge. Thus have I heard, once the Blessed One was dwelling in Rajagriha at Vulture Peak Mountain, together with a great gathering of the Sangha of monks and a great gathering of the Sangha of bodhisattvas. At that time, the Blessed One entered the samadhi that expresses the Dharma called profound illumination, and at the same time, noble Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva, while practicing the profound Prajnaparamita, saw in this way. He saw the 5 skandhas to be empty of nature. Then, through the power of the Buddha, Venerable Shariputra said to noble Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva, "How should a son or daughter of noble family train who wishes to practice the profound Prajnaparamita?" Addressed in this way, noble Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva, said to Venerable Shariputra, "O Shariputra, a son or daughter of noble family who wishes to practice the profound Prajnaparamita should see in this way. Seeing the 5 skandhas to be empty of nature. Form is emptiness, emptiness also is form, emptiness is no other than form, form is no other than emptiness. In the same way, feeling, perception, formation, and consciousness are emptiness. Thus, Shariputra, all dharmas are emptiness. There are no characteristics, there is no birth and no cessation. There is no impurity and no purity. There is no decrease and no increase. Therefore, Shariputra, in emptiness there is no form, no feeling, no perception, no formation, no consciousness, no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, no appearance, no sound, no smell, no taste, no touch, no dharmas, no I dhatu up to no mind dhatu, no dhatu of dharmas, no mind consciousness dhatu, no ignorance, no end of ignorance up to old age and death, no end of old age and death, no suffering, no origin of suffering, no cessation of suffering, no path, no wisdom, no attainment, and no non-attainment. Therefore, Shariputra, since the bodhisattvas have no attainment, they abide by means of Prajnaparamita. Since there is no obscuration of mind, there is no fear. They transcend falsity and attain complete nirvana. All the Buddhas of the 3 times by means of Prajnaparamita fully awaken to unsurpassable, true, complete enlightenment. Therefore, the great mantra of Prajnaparamita, the mantra of great insight, the unsurpassed mantra, the unequaled mantra, the mantra that calms all suffering should be known as truth since there is no deception. Prajnaparamita mantra is said in this way. Te ata om gate gate paragate parasangati bodhisoha. Thus Shariputra, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva, should train in the profound Prajnaparamita. Then the Blessed One arose from that samadhi and praised noble Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva, saying, "Good, good, O son of noble family, thus it is, O son of noble family, thus it is. One should practice the profound Prajnaparamita just as you have taught, and all the Tathagatas will rejoice." And when the Blessed One had said this, Venerable Shariputra and noble Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva, that whole assembly in the world with its gods, humans, asuras, and Gandharvas rejoiced and praised the words of the Blessed One. Chandara Samaraya me ne ata om gate gate paragate parasangati bodhisoha Baba Gonja Zonji Gai Dembe Doji She Obodoji Bodoji She Bodoji Dagi Baji Medombe Jodanji Jedingo Yezo Gere Dunja Jejo Jewada Medon Nube Jendan Dewadan Domba Junjin Bunzun Zun Yoji Yashi De Jan Na De Le Jo. The fundamental ground is scented with incense and strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, the 4 continents, the sun, and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha land and offer it. May all sentient beings enjoy this pure realm. Holy Lamas high, wrap the sky of your Dharma bodies in massive clouds of knowledge and love, and let them pour upon the earth of your disciples as we are ready, a shower of rain, the teachings deep and wide. 在一 Thank you. I send forth this jeweled mandala to you, precious Guru. Yedam Guru Ratna Mandala Gam Niratayami. Yadan Jadi Janam La Janju Badu Dani Yasuji Dagi Chinye Jibe Sunamri Jala Benji Zanye Rubaru Chidan Jadi Janam La Janju Badu Dani Yasuji Dagi Chinye Jibe Sunam Jindra La Benji Zanye Rubayu Chidan Zaji Janam La Janju Badu Dani Yasu Jindagi Chinye Jibe Sunam Jindra La Benji Zanye Rubayu.
Oya tatarin otote larit murad marbata lat dawshin de bisudan tenelo jidajan rbani tenelo jidajan rbadal taite la jibul bisu ani bujadal bisu ta jibu jadal bisu da jibu chungu da tumul laji jamal lojan bisu da dinda tumul laji jamal lojan bisu jibu chibi laji jamal lojan bisu sunle jibu chungu da tumul laji jamal lojan bisu tala samba jamal ngoda samba jibite tala lo dusewa samba jamal ngoda jandu ta lende ni marba ane lende ni ta jandu saji ni ba lende di lende ta ni ba lende tala tawa le kasabulari saji jina ni ba dele thaji tawa ishi ji deba ji bala sun lende shi samba ta sheda to samba ta sane judu shatus saji sun remde saji sun wada lari ke saji to kale kallo 차 몸도 고는 콜론 자들스 그 때문에 참 그래 실망은 싸는 소는데 그 집안 나를 내어들래 위답 차용 그랬어.
So again, we're looking at the text, the great treatise on the stage of the path to enlightenment by Lama Tsong-kha-pa. And we'll look at the outline initially, because if we keep going over the outline again and again, then when we hear these topics, we'll know exactly what these topics mean. So it's important for us to go over this again and again, or familiarize ourselves with this. So it begins with how to rely upon the teacher that is the root of the path. And then the second category of how students train their minds after having relied upon the teacher. Under that heading, we have an exhortation to take full advantage of a life of leisure and opportunity, and then a category of how to take full advantage of a life of leisure and opportunity. Under the heading of how to take full advantage of a life of leisure and opportunity, we have three major points: training the mind in the stage of the past shared in common with beings of small capacity, training the mind in the stage of the past shared in common with beings of medium capacity, and training the mind in the stage of the path for beings of great capacity. The first category, training the mind in the stage of the past shared in common with beings of small capacity, has three categories: the actual training of thought of a person of small capacity, the measure of the attitude of a person of small capacity, and dispelling any misconceptions related to a person of small capacity. Under the actual training of thought of a person of small capacity, the two categories: developing a state of mind that strives diligently for the sake of future lives and relying on a means or a method for achieving happiness in one's next life. Under the category of relying on a means of achieving happiness in one's next life, which is under the major heading of the actual training of thought of a person of small capacity, we find two categories. First, refuge, and then karma and its results. And the actual heading under the category of karma and its results is developing faith and conviction in karma and its result that is the root of all temporary happiness and certain goodness. So this is the major heading, and then there are three different categories under that heading. First, reflecting on karma and its results in general, then reflecting on karma and its results in detail or specifically in a particular way, and then how to engage in virtue and turn away from non-virtue after you've reflected on karma and its effects in general and specifically, or in general and in detail. So this is the order of the outline that we are going to go through. Diksun.
다 렌데셔 좀바들 응원다 안에 소소시듯이 니제 응원들라 레게비 줄레 베쳐와 레 마지바도 마제벨 레셔바 춤무자와 대시드렌도와 대시드말베
Less so.
Yeah.
So the first major category, reflecting on karma and its effects in general, has two categories: the actual way in which you reflect in general, and then reflecting on the distinctions among the varieties of karma, or the differences among the varieties of karma. So the first category of the actual way to reflect in general has 4 points: the certainty of karma, the magnification of karma, not experience the effects of actions that you did not do, and that the actions you have done do not perish or do not cease. So these are the 4 categories. So we're on page 210 in the English of the Lamrim Chenmo, where we begin with those 4 categories and the certainty of karma.
What the Lamrim Chenmo the beijina de doa wala so jatang ngaju ngajiro ni ba dele tangji tawa ichi deba jebala son leshe samba de sheda samba sonne jodu shatu los what could the Lamrim Chenmo tenjana.
So we're on page 210, and we're going to rely upon the text where it begins with the categories of reflecting on karma, its effects in general, reflecting on it specifically, and how you modify your behavior after you've reflected on karma and its effects in general and specifically. So these are or how to engage in virtue and turn away from non-virtue after you reflected on karma and its effects in general and specifically. So we're going to begin with those 3 parts, beginning with reflecting on karma and its effects in general, and in the 2 categories, and then the 4 that start with the first.
다 레셔 sombatla ngwada ane gasa susushitreba ngwada odni marba od tatne leshi sombatla chizamba ngwada susushit samba od ambula jeles
Lessa.
ngwada jele ngebitu lebechewa le majiba da majiba leshe bechumeso od digitle mudu od digital kanzukula jete shene and ulumudon mare.
So then when we get into this section, when we read through in the Lamrim, it says then, reflecting on karma and its effects in general are divided into 2. The actual way to reflect on karma, the actual way in which to reflect in general, and then the reflecting on the distinctions among the varieties of karma. in the distinctions among the individual, thinking of the distinctions of the individual karmas. So we begin then with the four. It says, I'm just reading the Lamrim Chenmo in Tibetan right now. We begin now with the four. And these four are under the heading called the certainty of karma. And then the four are the certainty of karma, the magnification of karma, not experiencing the effects of actions that you do not do, and the actions that you have done do not perish. So these are the four categories under the certainty of karma. And just as a note, in the Tibetan, it goes through them individually. You don't see that four listed. It goes the first one, then the explanation, then the second one, the explanation. You don't have this little outline.
Da le ngebe chudo de mar da ngazo le de la le ji le ngak le an yile so mar yile so an le magwa ngale magwa an yile magwa so je tel ba je ba shna chu magwa chu mar ba tene gwa so gi le jo le ji le so ma so ngak na ba je e ji na ba so bombe magwa chu de bombe Chudin de la Mogjubu Chudin said Marba, Gile Marba, Gile and the Butler, the Wayungre, the Magi leg and the Butler Dungre, Dung Epares, Gile, the Way Jongi, and the Dung Mares, Magi Lele Dung Jongi, the Wayungumare, the Susan Elders, laying Nebas, what does Marba?
The Megawa Jew Pomit Sutrim, Epa John Goa. Yengo gang in Suchin.
Banjuala, that's so that Sutin and Sutu, Sutin is a girl and Sutuguima, Leme Sutin is a rota. Sutak Sutila, Naju Sutin.
Okay.
Nabanju Sutin on the Nas or the Kazan or the truth again of Yendo. Don't know.
Okay. Okay, the nature on it, doing it's all down. So we begin with the certainty of karma. So here, this is referring to, when we speak of karma, we're referring to action. And this is action that we engage in through our body, speech, and mind. Non-virtuous activities, we can say, are the negative deeds that we do through our through our body, speech, and mind. And we could expand the word non-virtue by qualifying it, or by using the term the 10 non-virtuous activities. So any among the 10 non-virtuous activities, or non-virtue, that we engage in through our body, speech, and mind causes suffering. Necessarily. It certainly will produce suffering, because non-virtue necessarily produces suffering. And when we speak of virtue, this is action that is virtuous that we engage in through our body, speech, and mind. And if we look at it in terms of the 10 non-virtuous activities, if we abandon those non-virtuous activities, then this becomes the ethics which abandons the 10 non-virtuous activities, or among the 10 non-virtuous activities. So if we abandon any among the 3 non-virtues of the body, or the 4 non-virtues of the speech, or 3 non-virtues of the mind, then we necessarily are engaging in an ethics which abandons any among the 10 non-virtuous activities. So this is how we engage in virtue, and virtue necessarily gives rise to happiness. So this is the certainty of virtue. So the certainty of non-virtue is that it gives rise to suffering, and the certainty of virtue is that it necessarily gives rise to happiness. So this is what is meant by that. And my question that I just asked is that does the ethics which abandons the 10 non-virtuous activities require renunciation? Because of the previous discussion that if it's an ethics that requires renunciation, and Rinpoche qualified that is specifically speaking of the individual liberation ethics. So the individual liberation ethics necessarily require renunciation. So before, if that was said in a way that was different, the individual liberation ethics require this renunciation. And Rinpoche asked if this was real ethics, if one abandons the 10 non-virtues, if he or she doesn't have renunciation. And in this case, this is ethics. The ethics that are qualified by having renunciation are the individual liberation vows, those sets of the 8. Those are necessarily have renunciation in order for it to be called one engaging in that ethic. Okay, so just to clarify that. So we'll do.
하다 사마로 도와줘다 도와도 주간 되는 중원에서나 주대 기일을 되는 중원에서 다도 동에도 주간 되는 중원에서나 아니 매기를 되는 동에 중원에서 동에 다섯 배리서 되는 말이야 근데 동에 밥이 담바 오지 담바지는 동에 밥이 담바 동에 밥이 담바 동에 담바들라 동에지 동에 주 동에 차반 뒤지 동에 송요 말이야 차반 뒤지 동에서나 하는 아주 공부도 많아요. 공부 때 그 레더냐 뭐 좋아 인자 코지야다 신뢰하다 내야를 좋아요 말아. 마다니 비트에서도 좋아시 동해 많이 유 동해다 차반 뒤지도 동해 많이데 레뉴지 정화지 임베시 레뉴지 정화지에서 동해 많이데 사브린 벨 많이 베시 어떤 게 보고도
Judungyo, then Chabaduji.
Okay. Yeah.
Again, just for the sake of clarity, today again I'm going to use the two words suffering and pain to differentiate. It's one Tibetan word. It's the same word, and it's Dugnyal and Dugnyawa. And we always translate it as suffering into English, but it begins to be complicated if I use one word. So I'm going to use suffering and pain. So the main suffering, the macro type of suffering is suffering, and pain is going to be specifically a feeling of suffering. So when I use those terms, those are the terms I'm going to use. So all sentient beings have feelings of happiness. We see that every sentient being, humans and non-humans, sentient beings in general, possess feelings of happiness. Where did these feelings of happiness come from? They came from previous virtuous actions that they have engaged in. So the feelings that all sentient beings, humans, have that are happy are caused by virtue. All sentient beings also have suffering and suffering feelings. So where did this come from? Where did this suffering come from? Where did these suffering feelings come from? And they necessarily came from non-virtue. When we look at the Four Noble Truths, we find the first statement that Buddha made is that this is the superior truth of suffering. And under that statement, the superior truth of suffering, we can divide suffering into three categories. The suffering of change, and pervasive compounded suffering. And this is where the terms become important. So when we look at these different categories, if we look at this last kind of suffering, the pervasive compounded suffering, this is the suffering that makes us, because of our karma and afflictions, take on a set of aggregates again and again and again that is beyond our control. We are forced into these set of aggregates because of our karma and afflictions that possess these various types of suffering and happiness just mentioned. So this being forced again and again is the pervasive compounded suffering. Now we say that this reality isn't a feeling of suffering. It's a reality. This being forced into these aggregates is a fact. It's not a feeling of a tactile feeling or a feeling of suffering. So we say that this pervasive compounded suffering is suffering, but not pain. And then when we look at the other types of suffering, the suffering of change is suffering, but not pain, because it's not a feeling of suffering. Just as a note, it's happiness. That's just a note. And then the suffering of suffering is a feeling of suffering. So it is suffering and it's pain. So the suffering of suffering is the suffering we're speaking of when we speak of a feeling of pain. That's the suffering of suffering, and it's the only one that we can say is pain under the three categories, because the other two are suffering, but they're not pain. Is that clear? Does it make sense?
Can I ask one quick question? Just to clarify.
Okay.
The suffering change is, I didn't...
Suffering of change is not pain.
Okay.
Pervasive compounded suffering is not pain.
Right.
But all of those are suffering.
Right.
But not only one of them, the suffering of suffering is pain.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. 당아서 부샷 나로로 와데 미사바선 제 미뉴바레다 소수주다 파바스 가자이나 안 소수주도 파바 가로는 찬으레스 소수주 파바 마임비 가자들라 소수주라 그레스 팔라마도 가자들라 소수주 파비나투 차긴 가자들라 파발라 그러다 파바 이내다 소수주 이내다 아니 와데 쿠들 도와요 들어도 도와데 느끼게 버려 네 동에데
So then, when we get to the text and we start to see terms, it's important that we know what these terms mean. So here, this first says, whether of ordinary or noble beings. So when we divide beings or persons into categories, we divide them into two categories, ordinary beings and superior beings, or noble beings, sometimes translated as. Those superiors, a lot of times the Sanskrit is used, which is Arya. So a superior, noble one, an Arya, these are all the same thing everyone's talking about. So superiors are beings who have achieved the path of seeing. If one has not achieved the path of seeing, then he or she is an ordinary being. If the path of seeing has been achieved, then he or she is a superior, a noble being, an Arya. So this is the line between ordinary being and Arya being. It is the path of seeing. So once one reaches the path of seeing, then he or she becomes a superior, a noble, an Arya. So this is the differentiation between the two types of beings. There are no other types of beings or persons, only ordinary and superior. And any type of happiness that they have is from virtue, and any type of suffering that they experience is from non-virtue. So this is a certainty. Dixon.
What that what the debug in the Butla, the what the Debutala, debug the Butla, Swa Dongache, and the Gay Debutala, Swa Doai, but Susan, and the Gomulu Richenton on Coso, Magoa Dongan. Tishingando Tanjito, Gil the Tanjit, jogging the Watas, and the regent to one of those Marbe, or the regent to one to Konjane, Gimagi saying to Deja Gundota.
So we find that misdeeds necessarily give rise to the feeling of suffering, and virtuous deeds give rise to the feelings of happiness. And where do we find this presentation? We find it in Nagarjuna's Precious Garland, where it says, from non-virtues come all sufferings, and likewise all miserable realms. From virtues come all happy realms, and the joys in all rebirths. So here we can find how we define virtue and non-virtue right in this stanza here, how it's defined.
What that tell Dakashore, the Natsu Gawag and David La Swa Dewa, and Debug and David La Swa Dungas, Ngendagris. Tata tubatla image santen je zume je santen tambo niba sumba bad dawa yoaris dunge yo maroda ta santen je ba zume je de ane dawa meson yoda santen je ba ta zume je de soa de la tanyo madu ane soa dawa yo maris on du watel tubaduas what is game good.
So then, now that we come to the point where we say that all feelings of happiness come from virtue, and all feelings of suffering come from non-virtue, then a doubt arises. Do we say that in the fourth concentration level, or any among the four formless absorptions, that this is not caused by virtue? And the reason this doubt arises is because there is an equanimity of feeling in all of those states. So there isn't a feeling of this or that. There's equanimity related to feeling. So then the question arises, this state as a note, which is a high state. This is a high state. Is this caused by virtue? Because it's not. There's no feeling there. So this is just something you start to think about in terms of how that relates.
와지 다 디바이나 군 데부 소와 동에 여비 차우스 러바이나 안에 하지 팔레 저왕에네 안에 자진 콜 전도 제주는 팔 마지바제는 살진.
Okay.
우리 디바드긴 데부들 소도 동에
So the next thing you think about is if misdeeds necessarily give rise to, certainly give rise to suffering, then we find the story of the pig. Of the god who was going to be born as a pig, and then went to Indra, and then as a result of advice went for refuge to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, and then wasn't born as a pig, was actually able to be born as a god. So then we say, then how is this possible? Then if it necessarily gives rise to that, how is that possible?
다들 진면 대시자원들 가르쳐오래 다 도와도 동에데 네 기레다 마기레레 쇼머레스 주멜 지금 말레스 마툼 줄 지금 말레스 툼 줄 지그레스 올마들 해도
So Menje Rinpoche, Lama Tsong-kha-pa gets into happiness and suffering do not arise causelessly. They do not arise from non-concordant causes or incompatible causes and so forth. So then Lama Tsong-kha-pa gets into how virtue and non-virtue, how happiness and suffering are arisen. He gets into it by way of proof, showing that it's not arisen causelessly and it's not arisen from incompatible causes.
what 가서를 도와도 동에도 주멜 지금 말레스 주메벌 집에이나 준거려 알았어 도와도 주메벌 집에이나 도와도 주메벌 집에이나 신이 참아 줄 도와요 받았어 그주고 말보다 야나 도와다도요 받다 주무고 베시 야나 도와다도 매받다 주무고 베시 어디 다시 또 단데 말
The Jutsen Sumbagare, the Jume, the Pamba, the
주멜 지금 말레스
Dene,
주멜 지금 말레스
Tambo?
또 당수 솔제나 못해 줄 집으로 주멜 지금 말레스 다 주멜 주나 준거려 산당으로다 도와도 동에도 주멜 집에 있나 도와를 줘요 말레스 동에래 줘요 말스라바 있나 안에 도와대 뒤따도 여봐도 야나 뒤따도 매봤다스
Dock part, okay. Yeah.
야 얘나 사지 도줄에 동에 여봐다 주요 먹고 베시
Buddha, okay.
냐비 줄에야 사지기 도와도 여봐다 주요 먹고 베시 어떤 다시 먹던 타는 거다
So then there are various negations that are made within these statements. So why is it that happiness and suffering do not arise causelessly? So why is that? What's the reason for this? First point that's made is if there was no cause for the sentient being suffering and happiness, then they would perpetually have it. They would perpetually have happiness. They would always have happiness, or they would always have suffering. And if we looked at it in that case, then the Buddha would have suffering if it was causeless. If happiness and suffering were causeless, then the Buddha would perpetually have suffering. Then the hell being would have the Buddha's happiness if things were causeless. So these are the consequences of stating that there is a causeless. First, if there was no cause for happiness, there would always be happiness. If there was no cause for suffering, there would always be suffering. If there was no cause for if there was causeless, then Buddha's happiness would also have suffering, and a hell being would have the Buddha's realizations of happiness. So these are the consequences of stating that they are causeless. Decent.
단예버들 못해비질 제가 말했어. 주도 안쇼수 못해비질 제가 말했어. 시조선 장제 말해 장제가 어딘데 제가 대신데 사변으로래 네 뭐가 무슨 녀고도 아래 어디 놀로래 들 네 지도도 어디요 아래스 어디 녀고 사변을 집어 대세 시조를 집어래 달 집어를 들어다 주도 어디 시조를 집어 있나면 되게 줄지는 그래서 말봐 아는 가서 리터나 매거 트위 지금도 매거 사면 떠난데 지금도 그 주퉁고 말아 아는 매래 돈을 보고 지금도 돈을 매일 보고 지금도 그 매튜버는 말봐 주 그걸로 네 매래 네 튜비 네 매직을 마두지 돈을 서 지금도 어때
So the next negation is dealing with the things that are arisen from a creator, such as Shiva, or a primal essence, or a primal substance. So this primal essence is negating the school of the Samkhya tradition, the enumerators. So the enumerators state that there is this primal essence within things. That make it so that, for instance, a rice seed already has the sprout within it. So all causes have within them the results already because of this primal essence, this general nature that it has. So it's saying that all things arise from this primal essence, and that causes already have the results within them, because this primal essence is what causes everything to occur. This is negated because this is incompatible with what it produces. For instance, things have to be concordant with their results. So a rice seed doesn't create a mango tree. A mango seed doesn't create a rice plant. A human can't birth an animal doesn't birth a human. So the causes have to be compatible with their results. And when we look at the idea of a creator God, or we look at such as Shiva, or we look at this idea that there's a primal essence, there's incompatibility with the result. So this is why there's a negation that's made here.
So if
we could plant rice and get corn, then there'd be possible for an incompatible cause to give rise to something.
탑이 자와래 사지 공부도 비싸와 자와 이마도 어때 땡고요 갑이 최탄지 짓땡고요
okay. So if things do not arise causelessly, if happiness and suffering don't arise causelessly, and they don't arise from incompatible causes, then what do they arise from? And we say that happiness arises from virtue, suffering arises from non-virtue, and these are their compatible causes. And it's stated in the great treatise that this is the correct worldly viewpoint. So this is the correct view, worldly view. I'm adding Rinpoche's adding the word worldly to correct view, because correct view usually refers to the nature of reality. Worldly correct view is the correct view about the way things are. So that's the differentiation in terminology there, just from a note in the English. So that's the correct view, is that virtue comes from, happiness comes from virtue, suffering comes from non-virtue. So that's the correct worldly viewpoint. Lisa.
주변 지금 말하면 투비줄 지금 말해 거와당 길에 담기래 제바데 내가 싫어 주요로 와 와데 들리 단지 싸와이면 땡고여서 장시베
Jayan Sheba. Okay, so then Jayan Sheba states that, in summary, he states that if happiness and suffering do not arise causelessly, and they do not arise from incompatible cause, how do they arise? They arise from the virtue and non-virtue. Virtue causing happiness, non-virtue causing suffering. And this is the correct worldly viewpoint. So this is stated by Jayan Sheba in his summary.
So,
and the reason that it's stated is we find in the Lamrim Chenmo the same point. It says, of karma and its effects is called attaining certain knowledge of definiteness or non-deceptiveness of karma and its effect is called the correct viewpoint for all Buddhists and is praised as the foundation of all virtue. So this is hard material. This is hard material that if we, and it's very important material. So it's important that we think about this over and over again and have a very stable understanding of it. So the next category, go, please. Go ahead,
Shintang and Satang, Ratang, Chutang, Junde Bambuyoro, the Sutang, Nangi Junde and the Shi Junde, the Shirak Tocha Yomare, Nagi Junde Tochigres, Nagi and the Gawa Chungule and the Dawa Chibu Yungure, Dungan Chungule and the Dungan Chibu Yungures, what the Shedmar Pechawa.
So here, the magnification of karma is the next category on page 211. And it gets into the fact that internal magnification is much greater than external magnification. When we look at the external magnification of cause and effect, we see it in terms of trees and rivers and mountains and water and so forth. So these are the external things that are produced. But we don't see the level of magnification externally as we do internally. And that is that if a very, very small amount of virtue, when we're speaking internally, causes a great amount of happiness, a very small amount of non-virtue causes a great amount of suffering. So we don't see the same level of magnification externally as we do internally.
What this one is at Marabel, Le Pechavan, Le Gawa Chung Le Jang, Debo, and Dawa Shinto Chewan Jungla, Le Magawa Chung Le Jang, Debo, Dunga Shinto Chewan Jung We, Nagi Junji Pendawa, Shiriji Junjila Mentos, Nagi Junji Gedile, and then Debo Chewan Jung Najin, Shiruki Junjili Maris, Tian Tsung Le Tsung Long Dangdo. Tsong Dima, Tsong Rajumba Chubaki, Sanji Kanon to Dusha, Pashatele, Tsong Lagumba.
Lesser.
Tayan Tsong Les,
Lesser.
Deba Chung Shebi Jang, Jiden Paru Jishen Tansa, Deba Chung Shebi Jang, Jiden Paris and Joa Shimala Shima. Joa Shimal, then Jiba Chibu, Dungan Chibu Yungus, Jishen Tang, Pondri Chambo, Shenju Tenu Kasugure. And the Dungan Chibu Yungus Zero Pondri Chamber Sheju Te Tosa, Kobasun Toji no Honsa. So now Chung Shebi Jang, Jiden Paru the Chenrezig, Gawa Chujunjil Majiba Yinaya, Joa Shamale, Dua Chimu Yungre, Dua Chimu Dangres, Tuanchen Tajang, Shenju, Tunda Chibu Tajan Shenju Te, Rebu Pansu Meba. The
magnification of karma. An effect of immense happiness may arise from even a small virtuous karma. An effect of immense suffering may arise from even a tiny non-virtuous karma. Hence, internal karmic causation seems to involve a magnification that is not found in external causation. So we do not see the level of magnification externally related to cause and effect that we do internally. This magnification is not found. Then we find, moreover, it is said in the collection of indicative verses. The collection of indicative verses were verses that were put together at the Buddhist council by the foe destroyers in order to recount what the Buddha stated. So this is a collection of all of those things that the foe destroyers stated, the Buddha stated, and this is in a text. It's called the collection of indicative verses. It says, like a poison that has been ingested, the commission of even a small sin creates in your lives hereafter great fear and a terrible downfall. As when grain ripens into a bounty, even this creation of small merit leads in lives hereafter to great happiness and will be immensely meaningful as well. So things pointed out were even the smallest non-virtue gives rise to great fear and a terrible downfall, a great amount of suffering. So a small amount of non-virtue gives rise to a great amount of suffering. It says in your lives hereafter, so in future lives. So a small amount of non-virtue gives rise to great amounts of suffering in future lives. And then the same is said to be true about a small amount of merit. It leads to great amount of happiness in future lives. So Rinpoche, the word in Tibetan, lives hereafter, is, Rinpoche wanted to make sure everyone's clear, is that in future lives. So in our future lives, we will have this. In our future lives, we will have that. So suffering, small amount of non-virtue will give rise to a great amount of suffering. A small amount of virtue give rise to a great amount of happiness. Tiksum.
Da magi le chungu da gi le chungu le anen de dawa chemba da dongen chung chemba yong res ane loju yoares chungu le debu chemba jwa sa de yang hwa ji shong yu ta jue be ngaba jeba ne hwa jwa loju so go da.
So then there's many Lama stories that support the fact that a small amount of virtue gives rise to a great amount of happiness, and a small amount of non-virtue gives rise to a great amount of suffering. So then it's stated, become certain about how great effects may arise from small actions by studying the narratives of past events presented in texts, such as
ane jong tamba se wa tene doa long de se gro longe le son yo marta longe le naz gawo da ne ga naz gawo da ti kai je bi ba tan naz kawo se da kyo ba mar be ku bo jo ba ke to se be ba se ba yin ro te lo ju ji sa do longe bi ba tan ana ngamba ta ngambi loju nyai loju rubeji loju ngaja ta eda ngaja ta ngaja loju shemba ngaja loju lang ngaja shongwa dans wat khatu kar den go san jang ji beta kun loju gona de tram do de tege diba chung donge chem de bi chu do de den go yores diba chung 동해 제보 잼비 주도 대대고요스 그와 총 안에 도와 잼은 잼 주도 올마 장년은 좋아나 어떤 막 그와 총게 도와 잼은 잼 주도 오마드레스 장년은 좋이 그래서 셀라다 시다 라부 종이 종이 타지도 어떻게 그와 총게 도와 잼은 잼 주도 오마드 된거요스 눈다네
So it says, by studying the narratives of past events presented in texts, such as the basis of discipline, the Sutra of the Wise and the Foolish, the 100 Actions Sutra, for example, there are stories from the basis of discipline. So within this text, the basis of discipline, there are various stories about the herdsman Nanda and the frog beaten by his staff. So of a Rinpoche said a cowboy that beat a frog with a staff. And then was born 500 frogs, the goose, the fish, the 500 tortoises, the 500 hungry ghosts, the farmer, the 500 bulls, and from the Sutra of the Wise and the Foolish, the accounts of Suvarna Devavata, Suvarna Vasu, and Hastipala. So these, Jayan Sheba says, even if the individual stories aren't clear, are all explanations of one point. and they are explaining through by way of story that virtue, a small virtue, can give rise to a great amount of happiness, and a small non-virtue can give rise to a great amount of suffering. So these stories show these points.
What that long Chan that Shaman Penta Tage, Shaman Penta the Larin on Loju Tendua, Shaman Penta. Shaman Penta Tage, Loju what the that the Tambuto, the tagging of the shade theatre. Le page was at the she, Jundita, Nagi Jundi Jena, Nagi Jundi Sherato, she Jundi what in the Yomares, and Nagi Kanak Lindi Sherato Yoris, Nishin Dabundabure.
So now to look at the stories, we go to Shamar Rinpoche's text on the Lamrim, where it begins with a very similar point. It states that internal cause and effect is magnified much greater than external cause and effect. So it first is stated that there's a much greater magnification internally when we look at cause and effect than externally. So it goes over the same thing that's posited by Lama Tsong-kha-pa, just at the initial part of the text Rinpoche is using now.
So it
begins with one small non-virtue. So it begins with non-virtue, and then it gets into virtue. So it begins with one small non-virtue can give rise to a great amount of suffering. So then it'll tell stories about that, this text that Rinpoche is using, Shamar Rinpoche. And then the second part will show how a small virtuous action can give rise to a great amount of happiness.
That what the Kasore, what the Loju, the Gawachung, Debachung, and the Dongachu Ganes in the Barzana, and Hamal Galunchung Wares, Gulunko, she would to the waters, and then she do what the Doanal Tagalon to Goba, man, she changed Womarota. The Kotenaman don't go to Shield Daway. Good shield of Long, and the Saji Jeba to Pema to Nuziaris, the Shindba Yeruda. What the Deba Tin Debutele and Jema Kululich and Lungo Shindu Yogi Jibaris. Lungo Shindu Yogi Jene, Shindu Yogi Logil Jene, and the Jawashama Mapiba Degres, Saji Zonvaris, what the Gawachung and the Donga
Naga and Loyan. Okay. So when we begin then with the section that deals with a small amount of non-virtue. Okay, a small amount of non-virtue giving rise to a great amount of suffering. And we find first the story of the monk who was, where he lived, there was a tree behind him where he would sit, and there was a tree in the area, and it hit his head on it, and became very angry at the fact that the tree hit him in the head. He hit his head on the tree. So he became angry at the tree, and then went against the advice of Lord Buddha. So within the advices for monastic, it stated not to cut down trees. So he said it won't harm anything. This tree is of no use, and he cut the tree down, going against the advices. And it stated that as a result, this was during the time of Buddha Shakyamuni, that when he passed from that life, as a monk, he was born as a Naga with a tree growing out of his head. And he stayed that way as a Naga with a tree growing out of his head. He would stay that way, this was prophesied by the Buddha, until the coming of Lord Maitreya. So the question.
Oh, okay. My question was whether the suffering of change was equal to all happiness, and also whether the suffering of change contained within its category anything other than happiness.
So Rinpoche answered this question as follows. The suffering of change is referring to contaminated happiness, because the consequence to saying that all happiness is the suffering of change is that the Buddha's happiness then would categorically fall under the suffering of change. So it's only contaminated happiness that we're referring to. So all contaminated happiness is the suffering of change. And then asked in more detail if it was synonymous, Rinpoche said yes, contaminated happiness and the suffering of change are synonymous. So that was the answer to that.
Can I just ask a question? What is... I'm sorry. What? I don't understand contaminated happiness.
Sache dewa donagare.
Sache dewa se ta nga te kun judu ju chu nam de dewa tempo me ba de ne ben ro. Tempo me ba nga so an saba se so na long da ji le son ji bro. Long mo don ya ko do ngare do. Jun de. Ju de so de yimare.
So contaminated happiness is speaking of that unstable kind of happiness, the one that isn't consistent, the one that can go from that to something else. So for instance, when we become hot and then we get in front of a fan and it cools us off, that happiness will eventually become uncomfortable. We will eventually not want that wind blowing on us, so it will transform into a state of unhappiness. So it's that unstable type of happiness that we're speaking of that isn't consistent when we're speaking of contaminated. So that's what is stated. Yes? One more question, Ted. Says if we asking questions is good, because if you ask a question, then you'll know what the meaning of it, what you're wondering about is.
This is a question about the certainty of karma.
Okay.
And when we pray, I hope you enjoy happiness and the causes of happiness, or I hope you're free from suffering and the causes of suffering. If someone else's karma is already determined, why would we make those wishes or aspirations for them?
Then the true the gar shene nga tsu molan jaru the le ngepa the me kanga the le yure the le ngepa yin then sansang nga tsu molan jaru the sentient tamche dewa dang the then gar shene nga tsu molan jaru gangisene konso le je tu gumare.
Ta nga zo sinje taje dewa na de je da ba chusis shamba gumba shamba de je de gumba ina katul sinje de phang mar de susul phang urus marbe shamba de je ya konsuna an saje gumba to do saje gumba to suna sinje taje dewa lo ya de ne ma zo pu pu de be chong dos.
So when we're making aspirational prayers, for instance, when we're making an aspirational prayer, may all sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. We are, when we make that prayer, we're benefiting first ourselves to be able to have the causes of happiness. So by making this prayer, we're benefiting ourselves by creating the causes for ourselves to have happiness. When we're saying this prayer, may all sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. We are familiarizing ourselves with the first line with love, and familiarizing ourselves with the second line with compassion. So this is benefiting us so that we will eventually be able to become a Buddha, which is caused by these aspirations. And then when we become a Buddha, although at the time of making the prayer, we aren't capable of helping those beings or changing their karma, we in the very far future or in the future will be able to, because we will become a Buddha, and then we will be capable of helping all sentient beings in that way because of our state of omniscience that we will have. So we'll truly be able to bring sentient beings to a state of happiness and truly be able to help them abandon their suffering when we become a Buddha. And because of making aspirational prayers for those individuals, we will connect to those individuals' continuums when we become enlightened.
When we make those aspirations, are we in some ways changing our own karma? Suppose I have bad karma from history, and when I make that, is that shifting my karma?
Ngatsu molanjana, ngatsu susu le jegadue.
수수 질다 말하잖아 수수 그와사 용으로
그와사.
수수 그와사나 그와 근데부터 런디는 도와지지 말বে 수수 도와 용으로.
So when we're making those prayers, those are virtuous prayers. So we're leaving within our continuums virtue that will give rise to happiness in the future. So when we say changing, I asked the word change, and Rinpoche just said we're adding something that will then be cause for happiness. Then did deepa dagadue, molanjana deepa dagadue. So by making aspirations, it does purify our misdeeds. So then the word change is an okay word to use because it's purifying our misdeeds and leaving the causes for happiness in the future. You're welcome. Is that clear?
Yes.
Okay. Dixon.
What ma deba sono kaza deba chujun saba ina donge chibu yungures ngaso tama longele shozu kai ji deba ta nyata mo so.
Okay, lesson.
Chenrezig.
So there's examples about the magnification of karma that a small or a amount of non-virtue gives rise to a great amount of suffering, a small amount of virtue gives rise to a great amount of happiness. And there's many stories to show this, for instance, with the cowboy who beats the frog and so forth. So there's many stories to give examples of this in the Lamrim Chenmo.
Ta tanme nebatel ta gwa chungule ndo chibu yungures ya ndu dan ju se la dan se yi dan lambu jungi shongyu tajin de zade go chenji de yi da chenji ge zhen de do kong keba je da lo da ben de da chi da yu bu jil da ma song yu bu jil jeme ji da chuga ni wares ana koni le ana ka koni jobore ana koni bomba zama ji da na lo chu zama lo ana se ji lo ana ka je na ganil pu wares.
That's so.
Di rebula dene jawa tanje to koni zu zebu yongore ane kundu sabu chabares ane kaza naji jil jaga gulba ane shubujigi masal jene de gol bada bomboni zungina ane bogudu ji twala namanga ya san tange ane sanji chusone rajumba tuzores wotege ku bomba ji nalul chore se de yejere to ku sen de ba ya yejero gedi bün rebedle jawa nese jawa tantanjil zu zebu yore no kunu se nam kala kol den riji mazon shobujil je ne ana ku bogoni je ba ina karina o delji den chunje ne na da ju to bar man be odu loju gwa chung do chabu yungres loju te sungwa.
Then there's so then we first have the stories of how a small amount of non-virtue gives rise to a great amount of suffering, and then the next story is about a small amount of virtue giving rise to a great amount of happiness. And we find a story of during the time of the Buddha of a husband and wife who didn't have much to offer, but made an offering in some very clean water that was in like an offering vessel, a pot. And inside the clean water placed a golden coin and then covered it, and then gave, this is after the nirvana of the Buddha, and then gave this to the Sangha community. So they made these offerings to the Sangha. And it's stated that as a result of this offering that they made, in all of their future lives, they would have a beautiful body with a golden color. And then they were born in a place where they had water that brought gold with it up from the ground. And then upon hearing the Dharma in that life, were able to achieve the state of foe destroyer. So we see the magnification of a virtuous deed in this case and what it gave rise to. Small virtue has a great result. It's not similar to those external results. And there's more stories of virtue. So then there is a story of a monk who was going out to beg for alms for those who were meditating, so they didn't have to, meditating and studying, so they wouldn't have to break their sessions. So he would go out and beg for alms for them and then bring them the food back. And keep going back and forth to make sure that they had food. And it's said that as a result of this, in all future lives, he was very prosperous, only born in human and God's realms, and then became a state of foe destroyer as a result of it. And also the story during the time of the Buddha, where the small child offered a handful of sand with the right motivation to the Buddha as an offering, and this resulted in him being born as King Ashoka. Ashoka, King Ashoka. Two lion, kabiyare, dorjen. I don't know the place. There's a place. So near Varanasi, there are 4 lions. I'm not familiar with the name of the place. I apologize. 4 lions, and these are made by King Ashoka.
Yeah.
Near Varanasi. I'm sorry, I don't know the place's name. I apologize. Sanjay Sumba? Usum. So during the time of Sanjay Usum, so Buddha Kashapa. So Buddha, during the time of Buddha Kashapa, there is a story of a man who was meditating, and outside there were people reciting texts and so forth, and debating, reciting texts and doing rituals. And he became very upset and impatient and disturbed by their reciting, and went out and said, it doesn't sound like you sound like a bunch of frogs ribbiting. It doesn't sound like you're saying prayers at all. You sound like frogs ribbiting. And it stated that as a result of saying these harsh things to the group of monks, he was born as a frog 500 times.
What is that? 다든 추진당 주가당 따와젤레스 추진당 주가당 초와당 따와젤레 셔마 마냐시 하마송 용수 다바당 두바 마제바 창가르 냐바셰바 나 로제와 송데사 다 가던데 있어 추진서나 당아주 수주바 마지발레바 마동마셰바 주이서 말베 다 글로이난다 그추이난다 자와제서 말베 자와제 봄 추진 다 자와제 봄 추진들 추진서야데 자와제 봄 추진들 추진라 그레스 다 드마이 비드네 야 모자 모여로 집이 하나마도 신주 주고 말사나다 어떤 그 모자 모여로 옛날 봄이 추진들 추가라 그래서 추가 danse 초아서나 로츠 봄비 초아들 초아 근데 따와서는 다 아주
소와 세나 연주 세나 소와
로츠 로비 초아 로츠 가면 돼 가사 쇼노 어디게 로비 초아 초 로바지 뭐보여로 로츠 봄비 초아드 초아비제 제바들 초아라고 했다 초아 초아제 다 도와던 동안 그걸로 주멜 지금 말에 맞춤이 줄 지금 말에 아니 그걸 지금 너 집안에 비 싫어져 말에 싫어든 지대면 왔다 갔다 와서 말에 지대면 왔다 갔다 와서 어디 저러 지대면 왔다 갔다 와지 아니 사실 대바지 근데 지대면 왔다 갔다 와도 많이 봐이나 아니 자와지당기 추진 자와지 저당기 추진다 옛날 보면 추가다 안 로초 어떤 그 종어이나 근데 저와셔만 가려용 그래서 사지 저와셔만 가려 따와 냐면나 사질 장도다 레네라 이제 냐면나 근데 저와지 범위 그거 있나야 이말 지금 말했어 룰진 그랬어 아니 집이 하나마도 신주 발수가 도서 개연나야 니말 지금 말해 룰진 그랬어 아니 로비 좋았던 배제제바 이나야 아니 니말 로 말해 룰진 그랬어 어떻게 말해 롱텐 말했어
So the next part deals with things that have lapsed, what the results are. It says, furthermore, there are those who have partially lapsed in these four things: ethical discipline, rituals, livelihood, and philosophical view. That is, they have not at all lapsed in the latter, but have not completely accomplished pure forms of the former three. The Buddha said that such people will be born as Nagas. So the first, it says four things: ethical discipline. Ethical discipline is referring to the four root disciplines: no killing, no stealing, sexual misconduct, and abandoning lying. So these four are what ethical discipline is referring to. Rituals is referring to any ethics which falls outside of that ethical discipline. So such as the various advices of what to do and what not to do which are given. So any ethics which falls out of the realm of the four root ethics is what this rituals is referring to. Livelihood means abandoning a wrong way of living, a wrong livelihood, a wrong livelihood. And philosophical view is referring to the view of karma and its results, the the faith, developing faith and conviction in karma and its results and so forth. So here, this is saying that if someone has lapsed with their ethics, the root 4 ethics, ethical disciplines, or other than those root 4 ethics, which are rituals, or engaged in some sort of livelihood which is wrong, if they haven't lapsed relative to the philosophical view, if they still have this wisdom, which is a faith of conviction in karma and its results, if they still have faith in this, then it's stated that they will not be born into the hell realm. They'll be born as a Naga in the Naga's realm. So if there hasn't been a lapse related to their philosophical view, then they're, and again, when we're speaking of philosophical view, we're talking about the fact that the certainty of karma, the karma that it doesn't arise causelessly, happiness and suffering don't arise causelessly or from incompatible things and so forth. So as long as that philosophical view, which is the wisdom, which is the correct worldly view, doesn't lapse, then one will be born as a Naga as opposed to a lower than that rebirth. So,
zawaji bumbu da mogi jumu tudi de gangal genye da gangal yiro genye phama da nye da watege galo ma da gzu phama da ga yinjiri da
ale the choka yomare be
tudi da zana zawaji bumbu tudi dro na mogi jumu tudi le zawaji yoro zawaji da ane chuga da raji jikana ma do changpong la so ba yinjiro changpong chuga Chugatan Raji Kanamato, Mombada.
I see. Less so.
GB Kanamato, Raji Kanamato, Nindoni. Raji Kanamato Sana Rajun to the Jena Dibaje, Chimba to Jena Dibaina, Raji Kanamato. Sujabaina, Chimba Sujena Dibare, Tabak Sujena Dibaro, Raji Kanamato. GB Kanamato Sana, and the Shinjabaina Galun to Sule, and the
So there are those laws that are specific or for the individuals, and then there are those general laws or general advices or laws. So those that are, when we speak of general, so for instance, so I'll do this first. So when we speak of general, for instance, a householder and a monk and a nun are supposed to abstain from killing. So this is something that would be a general thing to advise not to do. So they're both advised not to do this. And then, but a monk or a nun is advised not to cut down a tree. But this isn't something that's found in the householder advices. So this is something that's specific to the individual, or behavior that's general and behavior that's specific to the individual. So when we look at these, going back to the different types of, it says these 4 things. Ethical discipline, when we look at the 4 roots, we find those 4 roots in all of the various places. We find the ethics which abandons the 10 non-virtues. We find those 4 roots in the 10 non-virtues. We find the 4 roots in the householder vows. We find those 4 roots in the fully ordained vows. We find those 4 roots in the probationary and the novice vows. So these 4 roots are something that we find in all of them. And then the other advices, such as, for instance, the rituals of advices such as not drinking beer. This would fall into that next category of rituals, and then the livelihood, and then the philosophical view, as just explained.
What does the Tutin, Sugar, Soa, Tawa Geles, Shema Manashi, Tawa to Manabaji, Jonathan, Lendela Ichibi, and the Teba to Manabaina, and Shema Manashi, Hama soon Tutin, Sugar, Soa, Yonsu, Taba, and Zuba Majeba, Changarin Yaba Sheba, Nasa, Tujitan Gewa, Chugatan Gewa, Suatan Gewa, Watana, and Joashama Kabachirisana, Sanji, Luchi was on the law, Lulich the Grace, Luchi was on the Jatushi, Louis Jabajato, Louis Jatushi, she went to Jurondo. 중된 데 루이 잡을 자수 쉬비도 어디서 생제도 소리용 어디서 인사래 중된 데 강기 다 개바 담버 자수 신비 나나 내바 당스 개바 담버 로도 베주는 되고 초딩 면서로 다 개바 담비 담보 자수 신비 나나 내바 나 루이 잡을 자수 신비 나나 내바 나그 자수 신비 나나 대바 나 강기 진시바 코아지 지된 현재 코아지 지된 중앙 뒤에 자주 준비 나나 로당 루이 보다 보모다 용어 주대 다장 큰 용어 주로사 현재 코아지 지된 준비 거서 자수는 루이 보다 보면 용어래 안은 나의 코아지라 용어이스 용어 주로 존된데 다는 자주 준비 나나 로당 루이 보다 보모 다장 내들 네 체마지드
Less so.
Tsong-kha-pa trame
Less so.
체마지드 장지 타두바 메뉴발라나 존된데 ndla 주간라 젠간라 존된데 가츠바사 와다드 루이 잡아도 상지 쉬이 모르다 네 개바 담비 뒤서 어디 루이 콩 자수는 요들 때는 그 코뉴뉴레 자수는 루이 보다 보면 싫어 뉴뉴레스 대선 범미세 뭐도 어디 주가를 쟁가를 상지 쉬고 이제와 존는데 이제 가자 봐서 루이 다보사 루이 다보 자수를 루이 잡을 먹으러 루이 다보 간다 레버 sombi 추도알라스 루이 다보스 간다 도알스메 추도알라스 온도 글롱 파마다 그투 파마다 기네 파마다 글로마다 어두스 말베 도알라 라도 쇼네 추tin 다바 노수 두바 마제바데스 추tin 마다바 쇼버데스 추가냐바 단스 추가냐바 추티냐바 추가냐바 라지지 카나마도 냐바다 소아냐바다 추티냐바네 요소 두바 마제라스 추티냐바네 요소 두바 마제라사 대다기 따와야 트람보 주데스 세세제냐와다도 메제데사 네 가사 추티냐바다 추가냐바다 소아냐바다는 이나야 아니 정도다 이데메 렌데라 이집에 대바도 마냐바 인소다 트람보 주데 세제냐와 나소 메지이사 세제냐와 저고요 말레스 안나 계산 로모모 요아드 가르쳐봤잖아. 녀알 제고 말에 주디냐라가 뭐래 롤르제 뭐스. 롤르제는 로모모 자더레스. 셰베네 루이지된 나소 제완주데 제송소스. 어디 갈래 구슬러잖아.
So the Buddha said that such people will be born as Nagas, and then there's the questions of the Naga kings of the ocean. It says, Bhagavan, in the beginning of the eon, I lived in the great ocean, and the Tathagata Krakachanda was in the world. At that time, the Nagas and their sons and daughters within the great ocean had become few, and even I had reduced retinue. So at this time, he's saying there were very few boy and girl Nagas in the world at that time. It says during the Krakachanda. It says, now Bhagavan, the Nagas and their sons and daughters within the great ocean are immeasurable and their numbers have no limit. O Bhagavan, what are the causes and conditions for this? And the Bhagavan said, O Lord of Nagas, there have been those who have renounced the world and went forth into discipline. So here, this is speak into the discipline. This is speaking of householder vows, fully ordained vows, novice vows, etc. So they have gone into the discipline, the well-spoken teaching, but who did not completely perfect the pure ethical discipline. So they did not completely perfect the ethical discipline, the root, which is the root for rituals and livelihood. So it's saying they did not have that pure, not completely perfect, pure ethical discipline. They were not completely perfect in their rituals, had deteriorated. Their livelihood, their perfect, but who did not completely perfect the pure ethical discipline. They were not completely perfect in that their rituals had deteriorated, their livelihood had deteriorated, and their ethical discipline had deteriorated. Still, their view was straight. They had not been born among the living beings of the hells. They were, upon their death, reborn in the places where Nagas were born. So what had not lapsed, where it says their view was straight? Their view, their refuge, going for refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, and their faith and conviction in karma and its result. So these views did not lapse. Therefore, instead of being born in the hell realm, they were born as Nagas.
Tembala chimba tan rajun ta sanji khoanji ki tel huma yin huma chimba tan rajun kaze chungba res and sanji tusuki ne tembala sanji tusuki huma chimba tan rajun kaze chungba res na what is later de ten temba khoanji ki tembala chimba tan rajun shiwata je dansa shiwata je chungba res temba setu ji tembala Shivata Tujureje. Temba Vesunji Tembala Shivata Jecho. Dacha Gitumbi Tembala Shivata Guchu Rebe. Shivata Guchu Domendo. Shivata Guchu Imbade. Yegi Madamendo.
90 million.
Sugadan, Suadan, Chutinya Besa. What the Sanji to the Tembal, then Chimbadan, Rajun Tenemodua. To Suganane, Mambuji Wade, Chutindan, Chugadan, Suanyane, and a Lulgis, and a New Major Lulgis.
So then it starts to show just how many people this happened to. So then it says, further it is said that during the continuation of the teaching of teacher Krakachanda, 980 million householders and renunciates were born as Nagas on account of their lapsed rituals, livelihood, and ethical discipline. During the continuation of the teaching of teacher Kanakamuni, there were 640 million. During the continuation of the teaching of teacher Kashapa, there were 800 million. And during the continuation of the teaching of our own teacher, 990 million have been or will be born as Nagas. And then it says, even since our own teacher passed into nirvana, there are those of the four types of followers who commit sins and of whose ethical discipline lapses are reborn as Nagas. So this is showing the number of beings during the first, second, third, and fourth Buddha that have lapsed in their ethics, rituals, or livelihood, and then been born as a result as a Naga, but not been born in the hell realm. So this is showing the numbers.
What the Sanji that our Huma Chimba Rajun to so the Chutinya and what the Lul Jibares, Yuan Tada, Joa Mada Chance, Joa Mada Chutin, Chugatan, and Swat to Mada Jan, could Tembala Ichibi, Tembala Ichibi, Ishi Tebanya Mares, Tembala Ichibi, Ishi Teban, Manyab Onki, Lud Shine, then the Metan Hale. And the Hatan magicians, so
it's stated that these beings that are born as Nagas, when they pass as Nagas, are born into the higher realms as gods or humans. So it's said that when beings lapse in their ethical discipline, their rituals, or their livelihood, but still can maintain their correct view, philosophical view related to refuge and conviction in karma and its results, then they're born as Nagas. And so here it's showing how many, and stating this fact related to the lapsing of discipline and where they'll be reborn. But then it's stated that after their Naga birth, they're born as humans and gods.
What the Sanji the Chimba Tang Shawata Mamu Chutin Tang Tawa Chuga Nyan, the Tua Nyane, and the Lul Chivaris. In a whose Sanji Tembale, Ichibi Tebanya Maris, Ichibi Samba Manyabi Onge, Lud Shine. Military Hal Chigres, Hal Chichi, and then Lata Magicians, Lata Lutushine, Lata Milchigres.
So these beings have, even though these householders and ordained individuals have lapsed in their ethical discipline, livelihood, and rituals, they've still maintained a faith of conviction in the truth. So therefore, they're born as Nagas. And this faith and conviction in the truth then allows them or makes them, after their Maga rebirth, to be born as humans or gods.
Ta Keba Zambudella, then the mental halching, Lut Shin, mental halchirwa. Keba Zambudella, Sanjawa Tadaki, Tembalas, Sanjawa Tadaki, Tembalasa. And Keba Zambundela, Tanjawa, Tadaki Tembala, Tijela Shuba no Matuba Asa, Matuba Jan, Nyangal Dog Shetosa. What is the Abmuda? Tashaja Tuba Tangul, Pesakengi, Sanjay to Luma, Chimba Rajun to Galo, Chirisoma to Luljiba Marva. Lulcine, Kuzu. Sanjili Chi, they were Manama is also, and Jalut Shene, Lata Malijigres. That Malijigres also, then the Sanji Kaban, the Sanji Tumpia, Sanji Tumpia, Sanji Shema Tuzuki, Roman Ajachum, and Tijan Shuba Matuba, Taji Tabaturis, and the Abamudu.
So then it says that nonetheless, it is said that although their practice is not pure upon their death as Nagas and transference to a new life, they are reborn as deities or humans through the power of their unlast conviction in the Mahayana. Except for those who entered the Mahayana, all of them will pass into nirvana during the teachings of those who will become Buddhas in this auspicious eon. So it's saying that except for those who have faith and conviction in the Mahayana, because that is attracted to Buddhahood, those beings who have this will be born as humans and deities after they're in the Naga realm, and then they'll pass into nirvana. It says they'll pass into nirvana during the teaching of those who will become Buddhas in this auspicious eon. So they will then enter nirvana in that state, except for those who are on the Mahayana track. So those beings will enter nirvana from that state, except for the beings on the Mahayana.
What is that? Sanji Gama to Suki, what the Roma, Chimba to Rajun to Su, and the Chuti Tang. Chuga Tang, Toa Nyane, and then Lul Jigres, Lul Jiba in a Kusanjila, Ichi, the Manama is Sonsa, Lushene, Hata Meligres, Keba Zambundela, Tanjawa Tadaki, Tembala, Sanjawa Tadaki, Keba de Sanji Tumpe Marve, Sanji Tumpe Tadaki, Tembala, Tijan Juba Matubas. Tijan Shuba Yina Kaban de Sanji to Manamadu, Ne Timaime Samalo, Kaban de Tabatures, Tijan Shuba no Matuba, Tanji, Nyangal and Dawasheto.
So they will achieve nirvana. So there are 1,000 Buddhas who will come during this time. So the 1,000 Buddhas will come during this time, Buddha Shakyamuni being the fourth, this relating the stories to the four that have come. And then in the future, these other Buddhas will come. So it's stated that those beings who haven't lapsed in their ethical discipline, those students of the Buddha, who have, though, lapsed in ethical discipline, let me start that over. It's stated that those students of the Buddha who have not lapsed in their philosophical views, but have lapsed in their ethical discipline, rituals, and livelihood, will be born as Nagas. When they die, they pass on from the Naga rebirth. They'll be born as gods and humans and gods. And it's stated that during the time of whatever the next Buddha is, in the 1,000 Buddhas to come, that being will achieve the state of nirvana. A state of nirvana or liberation. But it's excluding those beings who are on the Mahayana track. So it's saying that just those who are not on the Mahayana track will achieve this liberation, or this liberation.
Drubata, Ditum Tamaneja, Ponlambe Bashatesa, that gentleman, you said teacher, and a Gavachujina Drugure, Deba Chujina, Poal, then Bejanche Gure, Kalema Mujawurs, Bebasha, Beba Danza, and then Tamane, Drubata, and then Ditum Tamaneja, Ponlambe Bebashates. But the Deba Chujun in a bon, Gavachujun in a Drugures, but the Conquerors in a Sonless, Kalashata Nebati, Jamalhaji, Roajin, Leba Shetan, Nebashi, Da, do you Jesu down? Chitar Laja, Nuana, Nuata, Lanju Dungin, Roatar. Tenzin les ans, Majebe, sentient Gandudro. C'était déjà Mondobé, l'enjeu bane, Roatar, Tenzin, les ans, Chebayi, sentient Gandudro, chez dans ça. T'as de l'homme dans le ton. T'as quand t'es ça, t'as quand t'es son dans ta tour t'es ça mal. J'ai ta kala chata nebatis. T'as quand t'es en so chago lo mar, chago boche lo de ba. Chago le karza. Boche ping mati. Boche. Ego boche bud. The name Karza.
Vulture.
Shago.
Vulture?
Vulture pig mounting.
Oh. The vulture.
Shago Nagatombo Dimaina, Nagatom Ruinasu, Dramat me Tomares, Tomarota. Kokale Salamalesuna with Dramati Horus. The Naji, Gavachumuta, Deba Chuchu Sabaina, and then Deba Chuchu Takayo Marsa, Tanju Marmato. Dedu horas. Shago Nakal Podul Tramanton Marte, Telmalem de Tramando, Tendrapores, Tuji Tula Povite, Legan Driven Mingores. What the things are Shala.
Oh,
that's it.
Therefore, Rinpoche, the Te Chempa Jepo Garde. The Te Chempa Yomar, the Te Chempa the Jepo Garde, the Te Chempa the Nyanle Deba Drogomare Gangisina the Nyanle Deba Deomare. Then the Jepo Garde.
That's what's the Lumal Chamber that Galom Mojozwan. The two 13 down, Chuga down, Tuanya, and Yichi Teba. Consular Yichi Teba Manyaba to so, Nyon Dogma Lul Chigres, Lul Chigres Marva, Lul Chigres, Tata took Galo, then what the Sanjig Huma to Kalo, then Kebadala, Tijan Shuba Matuba, Sama, Yangan Dakris, Dajumbatus.
The Chenmo gare.
Tijabat Keba Tramasun, so Saguba in Zozan, Sanjay to Major. Sanjay Mungu.
Let's okay.
The Bijimendwa.
So my question was, Rinpoche explained the next stanza, and then I asked him what happens to the Mahayanists. Rinpoche said, well, because a Mahayanist has to accumulate virtue for 3 countless eons, that hasn't happened. So the Mahayanist has to go through all of the accumulations that are necessary that differentiate them as Mahayanists to make them Buddhas. So that work has to take place no matter what Rinpoche is saying, whereas this is speaking of a person who's just a lesser vehicle going to nirvana during the time of whatever the Buddha is, and there's foe destroyers and teachers. During that next time, after that being has left the Naga realm, he or she will achieve liberation. But those on the Mahayana track, we can't say that they become instantly a Buddha because they have these collections that are necessary to accumulate still. So that was the answer to that. Now it says, therefore, solidify the certainty that even the subtlest, so Lama Tsong-kha-pa is saying in summary, therefore solidify the certainty that even the subtlest of virtues and non-virtuous actions follow you like shadows and produce both great happiness and great suffering. Then strive to cultivate even the subtlest of virtues and to eliminate even the subtlest of sins and infractions. And then there's another quote from the collection of indicative verses, the collection of verses put together by the foe destroyers, and it relates this point that a very small amount of virtue and a very small amount of non-virtue give rise to great results. So we have to solidify that these non-virtuous small things produce great suffering. These small amounts of virtue produce a great amount of happiness, and recognize that they are always with us, these actions that we've created. It says, then strive to cultivate even the subtlest of virtues and to eliminate even the subtlest of sins and infractions. It says, just as the shadows of birds who dwell in the sky move along with them, beings are followed by what right and what wrong they have done. Just as when those with few provisions set out on the road and travel in suffering, living beings who have not cultivated good karma travel to the miserable realms. Just as when those who have prepared many provisions set out on the road and travel in happiness, living beings who have cultivated good karma travel to happy realms. So here this first point is that even though the shadow of a vulture can't be seen when it's up in the top of a tree, we can't smell its shadow, it's still there. This vulture still has a shadow, and when it swoops down, then it can be seen, it's there. But when it's up high, perched, we can't see its shadow, but it's present. Likewise, this virtuous and non-virtuous karma is always present with us. So that's the example of the vulture. So it says, just as the shadows of the birds who dwell in the sky move along with them. So a bird who's way up in the sky, even though we can't see it, still has a shadow. The shadow is with that bird.
and the shul the water doing the English, that I do just down. Jeta Lanja, Yuatas, Jeta Lanja, Jeta depend on Lanja, Yuata, Lanju doing Doaters. And the Langal do the Kalasa, they have Kayamena, doing Yungro.
Okay.
Doing Yungro, Tenaji, Goya Mazabaina, and what they Lanja Yuan is, and then what the doing Yungres. Lanja Cheta Lanja Nuata Lanja Nuata Nasu But Nasu Langa Ludi Kalasa Bajaro.
Lesso.
Tandale and then Gua Sagan to so Lanja Moache.
Lesso.
Diva Sagan to Lanja Nua.
Lesso.
No Deja Vu. Chetar Lanja Nuata. Lanju Dungan Ruataris. Lanju is Dungan Luris. Nesunda Mutal Jedu. Cheta Lanja Madeba Lanju Dua Ruata. Lata Malice. Dua Yungujero. Tijin les ans Shebai, Tijin les ans Sheba Gile. Tijin les ans Shebai, Senjatan Denudros. Les hommes chicken, Gile chicken to Galo, Denudros, who Denu Landro, Moriba.
Lesso.
Denudro. Shetans are what about Chilojana?
So then it says, in the sky, move along with them. So it's showing how the birds' shadows, even though they're up in the sky, are still with them. Beings are followed by. So beings, even if it's the smallest amount of virtue, which gives rise to great happiness, and the smallest amount of non-virtue, which gives rise to great suffering, are with that being. So those, even the small amounts are with them, as the shadow of a bird is always with it. What right and what wrong they have done. So right referring to virtuous action, wrong referring to non-virtuous action, and it's saying that these actions are stay with the being, stay with the person, just as a shadow. Just as when those with few provisions set out on the road and travel in suffering, living beings who have not cultivated good karma travel to the miserable realms. Just as when those who have prepared many provisions set out on the road and travel in happiness, living beings who have cultivated good karma travel to the happy realm. So here it's saying, if you go out on a journey and you don't have any food with you or anything with you, it would be a suffering journey. It would be a very difficult journey to go on. So it's very similar to those who have cultivated the pathways of non-virtue, that they travel to the miserable realms. So they have not prepared properly, so they to travel to the higher realms, so they travel to the lower realms. And it says, just as those who have prepared many provisions set out on the road and travel in happiness, living beings who cultivate good karma travel to the road of happy realms. So it's saying those who are prepared and pack all the provisions that are necessary, have a happy trip. Likewise, those who engage in good karma, which is the pathway to the higher realms, travel to the higher realms, travel to the happy realms.
What she dance ya just Tongre, that she Tongulong, she dance Lavina, Tishulong Tonglegre, Chitan Pachatu, what in Rodonam today.
It says, and also, so that means that from the collection of, and also from the collection of indicative verses.
Sentient Denudro she dance, that they Tongre. Deba Shin to Chung Lang, Manuel. Nemja, Chui Tiba, Sabi Jang, Pension Kiji Conjuro, Shetan. That Deba Chuchuri, that the Shira Yuji Marisama, or Tensan Danju Maris, Deba Chuchun Mamusane, and then Deba Chimuri Ungres, Chuchun Mamusane, and her she was the Kanyun was. Deba Chungu Dani. Deba Chungu Lang, many not to name just that Deba Chungu, that I know is Salmatas, or Te Deba Musa, or the Jema Dungemo Yunguris, but now Chui Tiba Sabi Jan, Chui Tiba Union San, and then Chemakan was
Lesser.
And then Shi Mu Masenshi is for the Deba Chuchun is good doing Umaras Malas, Masenshi, Chui Tiba, Huai, Pension teaching to Josie Sabi Debe Jan, Sheba Roto, conjures, Dungan Khan was Goa Chungi Dani Chis, Goa Chuchu Mamasaba Ina, Shugul Dawayungres. 시지미용 마세 쇼글 더와지다 용고 말아서 대주요 말아서 그와 주중지면은 사바이나 쇼글 더와게 봐도 용고 시지미용 마세 시상을 마다스 추이 티발 홍와이 본체 강화 대진도 동시 사비 그와이 따더라도 따버라도 강화주로서 되지 용거스 데르이도와 타비도와 산지도와도 용거서 시에당하사 와도와도 가리지 주잖아 답이지 어때
So then we find, do not scorn even the tiniest sin, thinking that it will do not harm. It is though the accumulation of it is through the accumulation of drops of water that a great vessel gradually fills. So it's saying, don't think that, oh, this is a very small non-virtue. It doesn't matter. It won't really harm me in any way. And it's showing the example of just putting a drop of water at a time eventually fills a bucket up all the way. So even little amounts of non-virtue will eventually overcome you. So we see that a small amount of non-virtue gives rise to a great amount of suffering. A small amount of virtue gives rise to a great amount of happiness. So we needn't think that it's only a small sin, it won't harm me in any way. And it says then further, do not think that the commission of even a tiny sin will not pursue you. Just as a large vessel is filled by falling drops of water, so too is a fool filled up with sins accumulated a little at a time. Do not think that the cultivation of even a tiny virtue will not pursue you. Just as a large pot is filled by falling drops of water, so too are the steadfast filled up by virtues accumulated a little at a time. So here the virtues that are accumulated a little at a time are those virtues that are the pathways to the higher realms of happiness and so forth. So here virtues cause happiness, non-virtues cause suffering. A small non-virtue causes a great amount of unhappiness or suffering, and a small virtue can cause a great amount of happiness. So this is the meaning of this. Isa. So we're not finished. We're going to go back over it again in the future. So we'll look at it then. So we finished the section on the certainty of karma and then the magnification of karma, but we're not done with it yet. The magnification of karma. So we'll do the concluding mandala offering and dedication to Chenmo Rinpoche. Shira Sobabu.
Yeah.
Mitrua Yuna Dakpar Selpo Shalabu. Charan Sonchana Dakpar. So we'll do the concluding mandala offering and dedication prayer. The fundamental ground is scented with incense and strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, the four continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha land and offer it. May all sentient beings enjoy this pure realm. I dedicate whatever virtues I have collected for the benefit of the teachings and of all sentient beings, and in particular for the essential teachings of Venerable Losang Drapa to shine forever. I send forth this jeweled mandala to you, precious Guru. I dedicate all this virtue to emulate the knowledge of the hero Manjushri and likewise Samantabhadra as well. With whatever dedication is praised as supreme by all the conquerors who traverse the three times, I also dedicate all my roots of virtue for the sake of auspicious deeds. In that pure land surrounded by snowy mountains, you are the source of all benefit and happiness. All-powerful Avalokiteshvara Tenzin Gyatso, may you stay until samsara's end. I pray for the long life of the precious Khensur Wandak, upholder of scriptural and realizational doctrines, the spiritual friend who trained extensively in the 5 great philosophical texts, exceptional wisdom and perseverance. Tuji Rimchi Gutsi Shabi Deronam. Lamrim Chenmo Konga Trilnam.